Okay, well, I might get started. So welcome everybody that's joining us online. So of note, today is an online-only seminar. So I'll just start today by acknowledging that the University of Western Australia is situated on Whadjuk Noongar land. The Whadjuk Noongar remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of these lands that we're here on in Perth. And we acknowledge the strength of their culture and offer our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today is week 10. Welcome. So the seminars for this semester are coming to an end. We've only got 2 left after Sven's presentation today. So of note for people that were here last week, feels like a year ago, but teams did remind us that the worst case scenario is still possible, and unfortunately Pook's talk, we couldn't broadcast it due to technical difficulties. However, and you can see on this slide, Pook has reorganised this talk through the Down by the Water Global Conversations in Maritime Archaeology. That page can be found on Facebook, and I believe we'll have a post on our UWA page as well to that effect. So that'll be taking place on the 30th of May. So for those of you that missed it, you didn't miss anything because it didn't happen. But if you would like to see this talk, then please sign up for that. I think also that's on Zoom. So yay. So what we've got coming up, we've got a presentation from the forensic anthropology side of the department. So next week that'll be given by Zuzana Obatova, and then following that, our last seminar for the semester is Tim Maloney. So, and he's, I've spoken to him earlier today, the presentation on the archaeological records of Borneo, particularly East Kalimantan, is going to focus on lithics and faunal remains. So I'll update that title with time. So the seminars are recorded. So please consider this as attendees and when we come to discussion at the end. So we have our socials, we've got our YouTube page, which does present some of the seminars that have been approved for dissemination. And then we've got a Twitter page and our Facebook archaeology page. So today we're joined by archaeological powerhouse, Sven Ouzman, and he has an extraordinary following here at UWA because we all really appreciate the work that he does here, but he covers a wide range of topics, so from rock art to graffiti, but today he's coming into this to give us a spin on intellectual property and authorship. So I'm really keen for this talk myself, and take it away, Sven. I will unshare slide.
Thank you, India, for that overly generous introduction, and thanks, Emily, also for your work. So, Nala Karich Whadjuk, Mutken Karak, Nija Buja. I acknowledge the Noongar Whadjuk peoples on whose land I live and learn. So today, this is the first time I've ever presented a talk which I don't have a picture for the title slide, which is hard for a rock art person. And this is one of those issues around authorship, IP, attribution, acknowledgement that sort of comes around and goes around. And so it's in that spirit that this is presented. It's as sort of full disclosure, I'm working this up into a kind of opinion piece. So the forum today, the online forum, actually works really well, and it'd be useful to have it more as a forum than a kind of Q&A, because I'm sure the issues in common with lots of people, and so there could be a discussion amongst everyone. And why this has come up is just things were trucking along quite well until maybe 18 months ago or so, and there've been a series of sort of encounters I've had with colleagues, usually outside of archaeology, but also within archaeology, that have sort of got me thinking about authorship, for example. So, for example, you know, I was chatting to a colleague about a paper on on Kimberley rock art, and including traditional owners and the native title representative body, prescribed body corporate as an entity. And I was quite struck by the reaction of one of the people I was chatting to, who kind of went, hang on, this is a scientific paper, you can't do that. And then they followed it up and they said that would be fraudulent. So, you know, I was quite taken aback, and I thought, gee, you know, this is not unusual in archaeology and the social science part of it anyway. And it kind of got me thinking a little bit. And then there was another sort of encounter a little bit more recently where someone had included, for example, a traditional owner on a paper. We're going through the paper, and I asked, among other things, I said, oh, you know, what does, you know, the traditional owner think of this paper? And he says, oh, well, you know, I haven't shown it to them, haven't spoken to them. When we did fieldwork a few years ago, they said it was fine to publish a paper. I thought, oh, you know, that's not right, because they don't know what's on the paper, for example. So it's a number of things like that that sort of got me to think it's time to sort of revisit this issue of authorship, attribution, and acknowledgement. So I'm going to start broad and then go small. It'll probably only be about half an hour or so, but happy to take the discussions until the allotted time, or you know, everyone leads busy lives. We can go home early, and you know, feel free to interrupt at any time. Unmute yourself and chat. I can't see the chat. That'll also have the benefit of wherever the logic's a bit faulty, it'll get masked by your interruption. All right, what's at stake? It's the usual kind of things. As we're in the business of knowledge production. We like to find things and find things out, and we like to know that that knowledge is reliable, both in its production and how it has been disseminated across a suite of publications, or as they're sometimes called these days, products. And for ourselves and our disciplines, their self and disciplinary advancement and reputation at stake. And then this will come towards the end of the talk, is, you know, is this field of authorship, attribution, acknowledgement a useful arena for things like reconciliation and exploring new forms of knowledge? So I'll start broadly, well outside of archaeology, with the two extremes, anonymous papers and papers with loads of authors. So starting at the last, just here recently, last year, Guinness World Book of Records record was set at the University of Birmingham, and they've got a press release about it and everything, where they have got 15,000 authors, 15,025 authors to be precise. And you know, previously the record was held by this Nature paper from 2015 that had more than 5,000 authors in the field of physics. And you know, we often joke about, well, gee, sometimes the author list is longer than the article. And in this case, we had 9 pages of a 33-page article that was the article, and the other 24 were listing authors and institutions. But I'd stop there and say, you know, it's easy to sort of laugh at that and go, oh my goodness, what's happening here? But in both of these cases, it's absolutely justified. These are both reputable journals and their subject matter. So in one case, I've done the little screen snips from the Birmingham one, is that, you know, you're trying to find out various cures and procedures to COVID and how to treat COVID surgery, a major pressing health issue. Obviously, you've got a sample size of 140,000 patients in 116 countries. So you definitely do need a large team to get that reliable information across at a global scale. The Nature paper is a bit different. What they were busy looking at is an estimate of the size of the Higgs boson. You can go look that up yourself. But incredibly complicated mathematics, needs huge computational power. No single, even small coalition of people could do that. And so you need 5,000 people to do it. And they, in this case, managed to get that size estimate to within what is estimated to be 0.25%. So not say, actually, though they look a bit ridiculous, they are quite justified. On the other extreme, I thought, well, what about, you know, publishing a paper anonymously? And the organization COPE, the Center of Publishing Ethics, is a very useful one, and they have a lot of case studies and resources and things that they have. And for example, here they have a case study in which 2 authors asked if the paper could be published anonymously because they didn't want to cause any harm to anyone. In their words, we have no wish to blame or criticize anyone, even though some of our patients have been harmed by unnecessary distress and anxiety. We simply want to highlight like the limitations of the test, for example. In this case, it was rejected, and usually is. We usually don't like anonymous publication. It's very unusual and rare there, and sort of thin end of the wedge stuff. If you allow that, I'm not really talking about peer review today and the pros and cons of peer review being anonymous or not anonymous. But so here you have kind of two poles of the continuum, from the possibility of anonymous publication through to a vast number of authors. COPE, for example, and also the Vancouver Protocol are very often used to guide us in this regard. So the Vancouver Protocol comes out of the medical sphere, but it's often referred to. And they have quite a high bar for what counts as being an author. So that, you know, why authorship matters. Author confers credit, has important academic, social, financial implications, all of those kinds of things. Similarly, COPE, on that little diagram, you can see sort of signs that might indicate authorship problems, which is very, very useful. I like the one impossibly prolific author. At a previous university, not in this country and not in archaeology, in another faculty, there was someone who had done a great deal of work to get a particular research entity up and running. It had been pretty moribund and they'd done wonders to get it going. But what they then did is had everyone who joined that institute sign a contract that every publication, without exception, out of that institute would carry this person's name. And it's a vicious cycle, because what then happens is, in 1 year, for example, this individual had 270 something papers published, most of which they had were entirely innocent of the knowledge of the contents of that paper. But when they then came to apply for grants from the relevant national body, they looked like an absolute superstar, kept getting grants, kept getting more powerful, perpetuating that kind of cycle. So, you know, there can be quite significant abuses, but we also at the same time have these guidelines that we have, and then there's a great deal of negotiation that has to take place. And just bear in mind, sitting in the background are things like copyright acts and what can and can't be copyrighted, and I'll return to that in a little bit. So who is an author? So according to the Vancouver Protocol, I was had a very short and spectacularly unsuccessful career, or proto-career in English. Like to look at the origins of words. So authorship coming from the Middle English in the sense of someone who creates or invents something and then later gets linked to authentic. Interestingly, COPE, who I actually find the more useful set of resources, has a very brief definition of what's an author. They just say authorship can refer to individuals or groups that create an idea or develop a publication that disseminates the intellectual or creative work. Whereas the Vancouver Protocol has 4 criteria, and you have to meet each of these 4 criteria according to them. This is largely in the biomedical field where it was developed, but loads of journals use this one. And the 4 criteria are as follows, and you can read for yourself, but I'll read them out. You have to have made a substantial contribution to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data of the work, plus you have to have had a role in drafting the work or revising it critically in terms of intellectual content. Plus, you have to finally have final approval of whichever version is to be published. Plus, you have to agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work, ensuring that questions relating to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. And so if you have someone who doesn't meet all of those requirements, then technically it's a non-author contribution, typically an acknowledgement, for example. So if you've just participated in the field work or helped in an aspect of the data collection, in that quite strict definition, you wouldn't really qualify as being an author. And I imagine everyone now is kind of going, oh, have I fulfilled all of those conditions in every paper I've published? Or, have I, for whatever reasons, let people be authors and they might not have fulfilled all of those conditions? So this is really just putting out there what is some international best practice. I'll hasten to add, this is strongly Eurocentric and Northern Hemisphere type approach. And towards the end of the presentation, I'll go a little bit on what archaeology can offer and sort of the global self, if you like. Starting looking at different products, I'm no means going to be looking at all products, but how about dissertations or theses, because this is agreed upon exception to the rule. So many supervisors will say for an honours, master's, PhD, whatever it is, that the supervision is, wow, it's a lot of supervision. My little anecdote there, and I've taken a screenshot, I dusted it off on the weekend, I couldn't even find the thing. It exists in an old Multimate file on the computer of my honours dissertation. So I had a very thorough supervisor. They were a former English master, which, that should have set some alarm bells off at the time, I reckon. And this was a dissertation thesis that went through 40 drafts. I know, I counted them all. And each of these drafts had, I thought, more sort of pencil comment. These were all hard copy drafts that went back and forth. I shudder to think of the trees that suffered. And then, they're all very useful comments. They're more than useful comments. They were great. They were mostly about how I'd misquoted various bits of Shakespeare and things like that. I thought was nice to use because I was trying to impress my supervisor. And it came that what I thought was the final draft came to me a few days before final handing of the honours. And I thought I would open it and see, a few fixes. Nope, same as before, pencil everywhere. And I thought, so I went in to my supervisor and I said, dear professor, and he said, call me. And I said, no, thanks, I'd rather stick needles in my eyes, you're a professor. I said, the deadline is only a few days away. There's no ways I can make all of these changes. And so I'm really sorry, but I'm just going to have to leave it as is. I remember him looking at me, arching his eyes, and then saying, I wondered when you were going to grow a spine. So there was a bit to learn there. And then a little bit later on reflection after examiners' reports and that were in, I got to thinking, gee, a lot of the ideas in that dissertation, they're not my ideas. I did a forensic. I've been led to them by my supervisor. And then again, I went and I asked, I said, whose thesis is this? And I didn't get an answer. I just got that enigmatic raised eyebrow thing again. But this is something we agree on, right? This is a training process. The intellectual input put in by supervisors would easily meet all of the authorship criteria, but this is a training exercise. It's a bit of a worry that some universities have situated this as a research activity for the supervisor, because that can open the gate to some sort of unwanted consequences, as they're particularly looking on the afterlife of a thesis, its publication, sort of an expectation of co-authorship, which really it should be a negotiated process, and it really depends on what was done, and it's a difficult one, but all of us I think need to have a little bit of generosity of spirit here to will be in the acknowledgements, but to put the candidate, the student first, at least certainly as first author, as per the politics of how it goes today. So we already have a kind of an exception to some of these rules there. When we then go a little bit further, this is again what sort of archaeology, the global south, is much better equipped at than the northern hemisphere, where most of the publishing houses are, is what about acknowledging collectives rather than just named individuals? And I know I was always inspired by Randy Maguire's Ludlow Collective, group of archaeologists looking at the Coalfield War, most of them committed socialists, communists and such like, who felt it would be incorrect to have named individuals in a kind of rank order, or even an alphabetical order, which would be assumed to be a rank order on this article, and part of it was also a feeling of solidarity for the Coalfield War miners there in the First World War in the US. And I always thought that was quite a neat idea. And recently sort of got to, in a kind of bastardized version, put it myself in the article you see about Invisible Women at the War in the West, and Jeff Clark and Marani. There's very nice archaeological perspectives on conflict and warfare. And so the article we wrote was based on a field school in 2017, and the field school is designed to produce a report after the field school for the, in inverted commas, client. No one is paid, but we work for someone, in this case the Coburn City Council and some public interest groups. So everyone, all the students in that class worked in the field and to produce that final report, and a lot of that final report I then wrote into the final article. And I then had some conversations with Jeff Morani and Tara Australis, ANU Press, about could we have a collective, in this case the UWA Archaeology Field School class of 2017, as you see in the author attribution up there. And there was actually no real problem. They wanted a bit of clarity on what had everyone done, and full disclosure to them. I said, well, they said, why don't you just list each of them? It'll be a long list, but there you have it. And I thought, that wasn't quite fair either, because not everyone contributed equally. Some people did a great deal of work, and everyone worked reasonably hard, but some people not quite so much. And then there was the issue of getting hold of everyone several years after leaving university, and getting their consent and all of those kinds of things. But it managed to go through, and I think it's a useful exercise and something students can put on their CV. Whether they all technically met each of those 4 requirements is probably a debatable point, for example. And then more recently, actually that's a reversal. This was earlier this year, and then late last year, as part of our Kimberley Visions project, we had a group of junior rangers come over to do a variety of tasks, including some experimental archaeology on how grass prints are made. This was in service of Emily Gray's PhD, and sort of Emily was helping with there, Joachim Goldhahn was helping with there. A number of people helped out. Kevin Keneally ensured we got grass from the Kimberley, all sorts of things. Obviously the junior rangers, their coordinators, the Aboriginal Corporation, Balngara, and all of that. So we made these, we made great grass prints on the walls, various walls of UWA. Facilities management didn't probably know about all of that. And this is quite interesting, because we don't people have often said grass prints are just thrown onto a wall, but they're not. They're quite, there's a particular motion of applying them at different kinds of grass, and whether they could be grass instead of feathers for birds, etc. Anyway, long story short is everyone had a lot of fun, did a variety of all sorts of other activities. It was all nicely linked to the Australian Archaeological Association Skills Passport. But from the get-go, we said, well, we'd like to publish this up. And everyone said, yep, that sounds quite good. Now, in this case, we have an issue where not everyone is fully text literate, for example. And the other main thing is the minimum age to be an author. So a number of journals, so here, as you can see in the BMJ, they only recognize natural persons, I'll get to that point later, natural persons over 18 years of age as authors. So in some journals, you've got to be 18 or above as authors. All of the junior rangers were under 16, and it could be by the time of publication they might be 18 or more, but certainly at the time of the work and the writing, they are not. And so this is a question I've sought some legal advice on this from this university. And the short answer is A, they're not sure, and B, consult with the journal. And it has to do with, for example, risks of exposing people not legally adults to any sort of adverse comments and those kinds of things. So absolutely, I get that there are good reasons to have an age threshold. At the same time, they've done all of the work, and it's more than warrants simply an acknowledgement. It should really be properly authored, as the intellectual property therein relates to, in this case, Aboriginal rock art, and you've got the people of that country doing the experimental archaeology on that rock art. So there's a slightly unresolved issue as well. Right. What about then, so that bit I referred to about recognizing natural persons over 18, what about recognizing non or more than human entities as authors? So in some work I was doing up in the Madawarra with a group of people, in this paper in the Griffith Law Review, so it's a prestigious paper, and you wouldn't normally associate lawyers with particularly progressive things necessarily. But we have this paper on the emergence of ancestral personhood, and as you will see on the screen there, the Martuara River of Life, the Fitzroy River, is credited as the first author. No ORCID number, but there you have it. And as it turns out, talking to Anne Polina, who's the motivating force behind this, the discussions were, it's sort of an accident in that she had some initial discussions with the Griffith Law Review about this paper, talking about it and about the power of the river and the sentience of the river, and that from the river all things proceed, and without the river none of this would have happened, for example, at least in a West Kimberley Aboriginal worldview. And the paper, as you'll see in the abstract, it states that river personhood has recognizable forms of nature's novel subjectivity. And when you look to sort of early work like William Cronon's First Nature, which I think was the 72, we do within Western legal systems have the ability to cast forests, rivers, etc., as juridical people. New Zealand has recently done this, for example. So they might not be a natural person, but they can be a juridical person. And within archaeology, obviously, we have social sciences, we have things like actor network theory. And to me, this is a useful sort of test of those. You know, are these just precious theories, or are we going to take them seriously and recognize that we are maybe not the only agentive beings in producing knowledge? I know that might sound a little nutty, but there you have it, because we want to avoid the other screen snip in front of you about, you know, just toss a coin for the authorship and anyone and anything can come in. And we do run into problems even with so-called natural people, where, you know, understandably the journals want, well, what's the person's email address? And you go, well, you know, it's someone living up, for example, in Clumbaroo, they don't have an email address, they don't have an ORCID, they don't have any of those things. They have contributed knowledge, not so much in ways we might understand it, but they have contributed without necessarily reading every word or being able to read every word of the article in front of them. So this is, again, one of those challenges that we face. So I can see people sort of rolling their eyes probably at this stage, but cracking on those are just some thoughts on authorship and the various ways, which are mostly, I think, are quite exciting. I mean, we're intellectuals, we're academics. These are things I think we should engage with on a routine basis. Attribution, I'm not going to go on this very much. I mean, some journals, Nature and such like, have very well established, very clear tables of attribution in which you have to state very clearly what each author has done, and what cannot be done. So draw your attention there to, on the screen snip, about honorary authorship. So honorary authorship is someone who really hasn't done anything on your project, but who's probably been a friend of the project or paper for a long time. I mean, friend in a broad sense, and is given as a kind of acknowledgement or gift. And there are often cultural issues at stake here, as it goes on to say there. You know, it's not considered untoward in many Asian countries to pay homage to a senior figure by including them into a paper because they enabled your ability to write that paper and even the paper itself. Well, most journals do not consider, in fact, outright ban that, or exclude people as authors on that basis. So there are gaps here in terms of what can be attributed, particularly when you're working in Indigenous contexts. You know, for example, if someone has provided cultural safety for what it is that you're doing, you know, that's really important. That's vital. You know, does that qualify as an authorship and should be attributed as such? Just as one example. As I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I really want to just use this it's quite useful to consider attribution in relation to acknowledgements. So the next slide, acknowledgements, and doing a little forensic about, you know, in my acknowledgements, are there people there who should really be authors in terms of what they've done? So in the PLOS One article, which says, you know, acknowledgements are not just thank you notes. Of course, there's nothing wrong with a thank you at all. And they, in this table, show all of the different categories that potentially you have. They do end off with vague or other. And I think archaeologically we can help develop tables like that and guide ourselves and those who we're training into how properly to acknowledge and sometimes attribute people in papers and other products. The screen snip above is again from the Vancouver Protocol, saying, okay, if you don't meet those 4 conditions that were cited above for authorship, then you come here in into the acknowledgements. One of the things, though, is acknowledgements. They also go on to say, if you put someone in your acknowledgements, you also have to make sure you've checked with that person that they're okay to be in your acknowledgements. Now, a lot of people don't do this. They think it's a classic case of no good deed goes unpunished, or potentially, is they think they're doing a good thing. But I had a case where it wasn't quite acknowledgements, but it was in a presentation where I put a logo of a particular government department in. They were formerly a project partner, but they were quite upset afterwards because they said that then implies we endorsed what you had to say. I had sent them the paper, the presentation. They hadn't viewed it, but you know, are the people you're acknowledging, do they know that they're being acknowledged in this paper, and B, are they happy to be so included? So there's a bit of work probably we all need to do around acknowledgements as well. Right, so moving into the latter part of the last sort of half dozen slides or so, sort of asking the questions, what can we from an archaeological and indigenous point of view offer? In this country, we have, for example, IATSIS guidelines. They're very much understandably more focused on Aboriginal people and corporations and entities as the authors, and sometimes the sole authors, rather than co-authorship with folks like ourselves. But they nonetheless provide, if not the letter of the law, so to speak, certainly the spirit of the law. And this has been taken up at UWA, for example, in the Intellectual Cultural and Indigenous Intellectual Cultural Property Protocol. Terry Janke and her firm got this together, closely referenced it to IATSIS and so on. It's interesting, it's worthwhile having a look at what they say about co-authorship. So in section 16 and subsections, they say when a significant contribution of ICIP is imparted orally by an Indigenous person for the production of a book, a report, written materials, or other outcomes, they should be, and again, there are 4 conditions, ask permission for use and provide any cultural protocols on restriction of use. And of course, we have our ethics protocols that come and reinforce this. So there needs to be free, prior, and informed consent, of course. So that earlier anecdote of asking, you know, a traditional owner if it's okay to publish an article several years hence wouldn't meet the threshold of free, prior, and informed consent, because they've got no idea what form that publication or product would take, where it would be disseminated, and so on. Secondly, given an opportunity to review and comment on the compiled book, report, etc. So this is a good one, because what this does is it forces people to maintain their relationships with, in this case, traditional owners, Indigenous people, or other sort of non-standard, non-academic groups of people, public interest societies, and those kinds of things, rather than popping out of the blue and saying, can you sign off on this for me, please? You know, in other words, it doesn't come as any surprise. It's part of conversations you've been having every few weeks, months, or that kind of thing. Then it says they should be attributed as a co-author or creator and share in the copyright of the book, report, etc., and be financially compensated for their involvement. So this potentially comes at loggerheads with things like the Vancouver Protocol, because in many cases, those 4 conditions, Indigenous partners, authors, knowledge holders, won't meet all of those threshold criteria. Similarly, with financial compensation, you know, that has implications for things like research budgets. And we've also got to be careful about setting up a system where everyone wants to be a co-author because they know they might be paid. The expectation of payment sets up a power relation. You're doing ethnographic work, and people then are under even more pressure to tell you things they think you want to hear, type of thing. But those are, you know, issues that are not new and get worked through. But this is something that will be largely binding, certainly on UWA researchers. So there are some things that I think productively sort of shape the cage of this rather strict set of rules we often have over acknowledgement, attribution, and authorship. Sorry, my voice is going, so it's getting a good time to end now. The other thing is then to consider, you know, it's very often, you know, the single authored, high impact journal is often the sort of gold standard, although I think certainly in archaeology we publish in teams as the norm rather than as the as the exception, with a rotating set of kind of lead characters depending on the topic and the work that has been done. And you know, a lot of what I'm going to say now is it's being done in parts by some people, but not necessarily by all people. So a few years ago, the ARC asked us to do a pilot study on impact, on research impact, the impact your research has. And it's still not very well formulated in the ARC guidelines. It's difficult to quantify in many cases. But it did get me to thinking is that, you know, for every peer-reviewed scientific article we produce, it should really always be part of a suite of products, for want of a better word. And we should incorporate that as part of our practice and our training of students. So, you know, you've got the article. Most people do go for a thing like a conversation piece or so. Joachim and colleagues have a wonderful one just today on bark paintings, and people are more interested can then go to the fuller peer-reviewed area. You know, news media, similar kind of thing, although here, particularly when you're working with diverse partners, you know, non-print media is really great. So videos, social media, radio are particularly good. One thing that does get left out often is a sort of local outreach in schools. The material we produce is, there's quite a bit of archaeology in the school syllabus. But teachers feel vastly sort of undercapacitated in material, particularly on Aboriginal history, but on general Australian archaeology as well. And so there are programs like the CSRO, STEM professionals in schools, that help guide and set up partnerships with schools, professional development for teachers, and that, because it's all very well doing outreach, sort of you and I, and we should obviously continue to do it, but we will reach a much smaller universe of people compared to a teacher teaching classes year on year, for example. And then, you know, there can be a range of other co-designed or produced resource materials, such as posters, which I showed before, plain English reports, and all of those. And of course, we're in the lucky position to have the skills passport, thanks to Mel Marshall and Georgia Roberts and their outstanding work on that. And, you know, that should just be a routine part of it, even when you're writing up an article. To help tick off some of those skills for partners. Okay, second last slide, or third last slide, is can this then all contribute to reconciliation, decolonization, for example? You're trying to be inclusive, including people not just in your peer-reviewed scientific article, for example, but taking seriously different knowledge systems and how it might be presented, whether it's within that scientific article. You could have a Derrida-style two-text, for example, or you could have it in other productions that come out in parallel with that article. And, you know, I'd sort of default at the moment to say, well, how can this decolonize? How can it decolonize? Particularly valent in Australia, where, you know, talking to a young Aboriginal art curator a while ago, you know, I made some flip comment about, you know, how is it working in a post-colonial circumstance? And he sort of looked at me and said, right, it's still colonial. And Australia still is very colonial in lots of ways. And sometimes I worry a little bit about the sort of decolonization phrase, not the process, of course, but sometimes it seems a bit of a implicit model. You know, we'll decolonize, but then what? You know, it seems to me there's a missing move there, and perhaps that move is something like to cosmopolitanize. Cosmopolitanism has its critiques, such as it masks the views of particular individuals and groups through a larger sort of corporate entity, but it could help free our thinking a little bit to forms of acknowledgement and authorship for people that don't necessarily meet all of those criteria. Because sometimes, like the screen snip there about, you get these statements about diversity and inclusion, but I think they are going along fairly traditional ways, dealing with humans, males, females, intersex, such like, but not, for example, Aboriginal corporations, things like the Fitzroy and the Wadawurra and other rivers. And then finally, and thanks to Ingrid Ward for sending this round yesterday after an advertisement of this talk, what about sort of new forms of knowledge? You know, we're very tech-centric in how we put knowledge across, but people think in all sorts of ways, visually, kinetically, all of those kinds of things. And this particular article, which is written by a psychologist and a neuropsychologist, says, well, you know, the problem with the traditional scientific article is there's several problems in that you've got a word limit, so you can't put all the findings in, particularly particularly if you've got data. Those are sometimes difficult to have there. And also, if there are mistakes that are made in an article, it's more or less impossible to correct. Whereas if you had, for example, what he calls online project notebooks, equate to many interactive websites, you can have all your data, you could update it, you could track the updating, all of those kinds of things. Of course, that requires a whole new suite of skills of already sort of overloaded researchers, but is an exciting possibility. And then sort of on the other side of the continuum, can we, validate or give validation or more validation to oral traditions and storytelling? We love the printed word, but is there a way for the spoken word, particularly when you're working in diverse contexts, to be properly authored and recognized? Right, instead of be 30 minutes, I've actually gone 35. On that note, I'll end and welcome any comments or discussions that you might have.
That was great. Thank you, Sven. Absolutely amazing. So I'll encourage everyone, I believe I've turned on everyone's cameras and mute buttons. So yeah, if everyone would like to turn their cameras on, that'd be great, just to have a bit more of an open forum rather than a Q&A. But I will start. So Sven, are you going to publish this anonymously? I am intrigued.
Well, I have thought on one hand, it's a little bit presumptuous, to have a kind of single author that then goes and sort of lays down the law and authorship acknowledgement and all of these kind of, points fingers and that kind of thing. So, maybe we should do it as a department even. So, I don't know, or collective again, anyone who wants to kind of get involved.
Indeed. I think, yeah, it's a pretty exciting prospect. I mean, I'd love to start publishing papers anonymously and just blowing them out. But does anyone want to start kick off the forum with a question or something directed to Sven?
Maybe. So UWA has its own rules on authorship, which I'm sure you're aware of, but we're kind of bound by as a group, which is interesting, and they're published in the Research Integrity Policy. And what was interesting when that was being discussed was that it was actually the authorship section was the most debated section. So in the past, UWA has always used the ARC authorship guidelines, and they were the foundation for the UWA one. But if you look at the UWA one, it actually, for the first time, has devolved from the ARC wording. So that we now have sort of a definition of authorship. So authorship means a researcher who's made a significant intellectual and scholarly contribution to the research described in the research output and is willing to be accountable for their contribution and agree to be listed as an author. That's a bit different to the ARC. And there's also, it then said authorship will be based on substantial intellectual involvement. And then there are 5 different things that you have to have for authorship, and of which only 2 need to be present. And included in that, one of them is contribution of knowledge, including indigenous knowledge. So I think it's moved quite usefully in some of the directions that you're talking about, and it would be worth kind of tussling as well, I think, with some of the UWA specifics. I'll send you that. I don't know if I can load it up so that people can see it. Yeah.
Sven, I did have that. I didn't include it in the talk because I wanted to give the ICIP one, because it's it's the typical sort of institutional type thing where not everything always lines up quite nicely. And part of it is I thought it would be useful to have the Vancouver Protocol as a broader thing. It's not at that much variance with the UWA one. My issue mainly is with wording like a researcher when we're talking about things like collectives and even more than human entities. So probably being a little bit naughty, but no, not actually, but just, it's a serious question to kind of say, there are different knowledge systems out there. It's a very diverse world out there. We engage with that world, and if it's going to go beyond tokenism, we need to, I agree, the UWA one is not bad. Meeting all 4 of those is quite tricky on the Vancouver Protocol. Whereas if you say, well, a 2 of 5, because that also opens up again to get to things like, when you're mentoring junior scholars, for example, it gives that leeway to introduce them into a system without them having to have done the full suite of everything. But yeah, thank you. I've got those.
Rebecca,
Rebecca.
would you like to ask?
I found it really curious the way you're talking about kind of the categorization of authors, because I noticed that a lot of the, the big conglomerate of journals like Elsevier and everyone like that, their submission sites for journal articles are like kind of almost semi-automated structures. And basically they seem to want everything to fit into kind of like a pre-programmed database box. And so, it's not because maybe they're not open to the idea of authorship being broader, but our database wants this information and that's all we're willing to actually consider. So it's almost like the database has started to determine how we consider authorship rather than us who are responsible for building the databases actually driving and accommodating authorship, if you get what I mean. Do you think that might start coming into it?
Yes, so yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Very much so. So an example of that one is and I'll name the journal Australian Archaeology, it's through Taylor and Francis, and they also have that, whether it's Elsevier, they're all sort of the same in that sort of megalopoly, if you like. And we had a case where we kind of had, again, this kind of disjunct. There are lots of miscommunications. The editors of our Australian Archaeology, are across all of these issues, happy with it, and we were wanting to list, so number one, an Aboriginal corporation as an author, and several traditional partners, Indigenous partners, who didn't have ORCIDs, who didn't have phone numbers and things. But when we went to the portal, we couldn't get past a certain stage because it said ORCID, and we went like, oh, and then it said, and you try and get hold of the some sort of human in that system, and I got someone on the phone eventually. And you could just, if it had been a Skype call, a visual call, you could just see that the weren't quite. So to run that by me again, they don't have an email. So yeah, not everyone has an email. A lot of people, working in Southern African even contexts and things, they don't have internet sometimes. Or actually, Australia has some pretty poor internet. Africa's got much better internet. But then, talking to the journal editors, it was no problem. They said, oh, absolutely, and they have done that time and again, and they managed to get it through the system. They've sort of got the back door, if you like, where there's negotiation with the authors. In this case, there's no need for negotiation. They're perfectly on board. It's been done before in Australian archaeology. It's not anything kind of new. But you're quite right in that, we are having this, I suppose that's where the sort of actor network technology, theory technology comes in the way of trying to express these things. And even then it's still us, the academic, if you want, accessing that system. If anyone else would try and access that system, they would just pull their hair out if they had any hair. So yeah, it's a really good point about these portals and things that act as exclusionary devices. Thank you.
I totally agree. Only recently, and I've had to do it in the past, and I've done it again really recently, I've had to put my own personal, not my staff email address, because of course it won't accept that twice. Put that into, an author who does not have an email address. But yes, anyway, moving on. Carly.
Thanks, Ben. So you might have touched on this, and I apologise if I missed it, but obviously this is a whole additional layer of complexity, but what about authorship for data, particularly data that's being shared open access? Like obviously this is an area that I'm quite interested in myself in terms of open archaeology data, where you have ethnographic information and community information that's being incorporated into that data set. And as an environmental archaeologist, that's a particularly common element of my work. Where we've got things like the care principles, which includes things like, aspects of data sovereignty and the ability for communities to control who reuses that data. How do we, that sounds like a terrible question because there is no real clear answer, but what are your thoughts about like how we can attempt to approach authorship protocols around that, especially when it's things that are going online as like additional supplementary files with regular standalone papers?
Thanks, Carly. Yes, I didn't really address that one. I was dealing with sort of almost the more normative kind of, paper, even though most of them never get printed out kind of thing. And this is very much that sort of last slide, sort of courtesy of Ingrid, where, if you had, so I know, Nature, lots of journals allow you to have your additional data at the end of the paper and people can kind of go through that. But there, of course, it might be that some people don't want all of the data to be there. And that's where I think, for example, having these sort of mini project website kinds of things, you can do a lot of, you can be a lot more nimble by, for example, having having different, so you can say what's there, all the categories of things, the actual paper, the data, the figures, those sorts of things, the contributions. But you could control levels of access, for example. So some things could be there for everyone to check. This is great research. You want to share all of our data. So like that COVID paper did a similar thing to that, saying, this is a public health issue. Everyone needs to know this, and it's linked to a website. There you go. Through to then possibly having, kind of stepped or layered access where, here's a bit that you can know, but in order to get the kind of nitty gritty, it might be part of ongoing research, someone's PhD, those sort of things, you then have to go through a kind of gatekeeper process. I suppose that would be, I'd have to think about that a little bit, but I think that's where, more electronic publishing would be useful on that one. It could also, the thing to think about always with these things, though, and Ben might want to weigh in here, is on the curation of that data long term. So while we have to keep it for the statutory length of time, depending what it is, 5, 7, 10 years, really archaeologically want it for a long time. If you're working on behalf of an organization that has no capacity to keep or store data, how does that then work when personnel on both sides change? Yeah.
And I suppose also when technology changes, and I'm currently trying to chase down a CD-ROM from a PhD back in the early 2000s, and whether it exists is unknown. When I get it, whether I can use it at all is also another unknown. So even technology and the advancements that happen really, really quickly these days are posing a bit of an interesting another spanner in the works. Pete.
Yeah, thanks, India, and thanks, Sven. That was an incredibly stimulating talk. I wanted to return briefly to ICIP. I mean, the full list of rights that are covered by that: literary, performing, languages, spiritual knowledge, tangible, intangible, cultural heritage, ancestral remains, genetic material, cultural, environmental resources, sites of Indigenous significance, documentation of Indigenous significance. All of these require a serious consideration of co-authorship. So returning to your first observation of the talk, virtually for anyone to suggest that you don't consider, let alone actualise, co-authorship is actually against the IATS's guidelines. It's against the national frameworks, probably the Australian statement. And I do think we need to get this message out as much as possible. And you've definitely got a long way towards that today.
Yes, thanks, Peter. Yeah, I mean, as sort of said, it's kind of our default to work in groups and publish in groups. It's not that it's the same, it does require maintenance of collegiality and relationships all the time, because sometimes, okay, that's definitely the lead person, they do that one, then there's the next person, and that's kind of why I kind of hopefully made clear that a lot of these guidelines are coming from the global north. They're coming from commercial publishing houses. They're just not really attuned to this kind of thing. So I mean, I couldn't agree more that your default should be co-authorship. I think it is changing. Some fields still have it, but less so. The sort of notion of the single authored great work that one has, those are becoming quite small. I mean, you look in the current Australian archaeology issue. It's all co-authored, other than book reviews. So yeah, that's the norm. But to me, there's also that strong sort of justice, restorative justice, reconciliation side, to push it even further, to say it's not just recognizing knowledge that exists over there, but where can we go further? I mean, we're always looking to improve our knowledge, and how can we make it kind of more inclusive, more interesting, those kind of things. Anyway, I'll shut up there. So yeah. So I'm taking all the comments along here. And thanks very much. Emily, and Carmen and Martin for those. Yep. So thanks, Carmen. Yep, I mentioned that country is often acknowledged as well. So Ingrid's question is about TO representatives hindering or blocking publishing information of, for example, environmental IP. So it's, it is a tricky one, and a lot of that is, how is so presumably anywhere in Australia, you're on Aboriginal land of one form or another, whether formally recognised or acknowledged or not. And so there would need to be an agreement with those persons or people, and acknowledging that even when you have an agreement, there can be sub-factions and those things. It's not always an easy thing. And it really depends on what are the conditions of agreement there for people. Very often people are sort of trying you out, testing you, I find, to say, well, who is this person? Where can they, what are they prepared to, how far are they prepared to meet us, for example? Bearing in mind, at a presentation on Monday, it's talking about the unhelpfulness in terms of fire management and rock art sites on lands, of having a nature culture kind of distinction, because you're working with people who generally don't have that distinction, or it's much more kind of interdigitated. So we might call it environmental IP. They might have a different view. Entangled with that is very likely a politics of resistance and dissatisfaction with the past and the present as well. And very often we are seen as part of that system. We are part of that system, getting permits and all of those kinds of things. So I don't have an easy answer to that. It's a very particular kind of situation in which it depends on what the negotiation of the project was, with which people, and what the likely products of it might be. So yeah. Celeste.
Celeste, did you want to come on board?
Yes, thank you so much, Sven. Thank you for having me. I'm crashing your archaeology seminar series. I'm a linguist.
Everyone's welcome.
Wonderful, so stimulating. I really enjoyed it. So I have a comment / question, but I wanted to say anonymous publications. Yes, they sound mysterious and potentially interesting, but now that women have finally begun to make it into academia, please do not make your publications anonymous, because guess what? The top 100 most cited linguists of all time on Google, I'm not sure about archaeology, maybe you guys are more woke, but they're all men. 100, all 100. So anyway, so we're trying to write a book, a feminist reading of the field. But what I wanted to say is, I'm so interested in what you were saying. Is this really decolonization, or is it just more tokenism? Can we ever fully decolonize? And look, I think that full decolonization is probably impossible, simply because we are in a colonial institution per se. But I get very excited when individuals are reaching out to journal, editors and people, and just saying, look, this individual does not have an email, they don't email, and they don't have A, B, and C. Could you accommodate? Because in a way, then the structure is accommodating to different ways of being and different ways of knowing, right? And so my question, I guess, Sven, is what's your take on decolonization? Do you feel like we're moving forward in the right direction? What else should be happening?
So 3 things. One is I wasn't really advocating anonymous publication seriously, just that it comes up now and again. Second is, make sure you have that book details available to us, and we'll madly cite it multiple times in everything that we write. But then, yes, I probably should. I'm not sure I understand decolonization fully in what it is. And this is probably my sort of pedantic, picky nature around words, a decolonization. So there are also these established critiques as well, is that, be careful of centering the colonial too much and thereby diminishing the agency of, anti, pre, post-colonial kind of forces, and that. Nonetheless, it did have a really big effect. And, what I've been talking about today, with just very small exceptions, is still within a very normative sort of capitalist extractive economy of publishing, and I wasn't even going to get into the issues of us ceding our IP to publishing houses and those kinds of things. And so my concern there was really about what would a decolonized archaeology or practice in general look like, and read a fair bit on that, and I still struggle to see what it might be. And that's why I say I think we're missing a more constructive move to say, all right, archaeology as a discipline is pretty much indelibly colonial, imperial, all of those things that came out of sort of dilettantes and those kinds of folks and went through its various phases. All very interesting in their way, and all actually have contributions, good phases as well as bad. And that's why I'm not entirely sold on, for example, cosmopolitanization, but it seems to me the kind of thing to look at, to have a greater diversity of agents and of, for want of a better word, products or things that you disseminate from your research, for example. And then, it would require those old things about, do you get credit for some of those things if you have a non-peer-reviewed article or, type of thing. So people, often, anyway, so I really struggle with that issue. And no, it's not at all anti-decolonization, but I don't think it's enough. I think it needs to be, we need to, using sort of classic third wave feminism, we need to identify what the problems are. And then we need to have a sort of think about what can we do to kind of transcend, to bring, for want of better categorization, almost, indigenous and other knowledges together with our knowledge to find that kind of third way that will maybe be the hallmark of a 21st century sort of socially inclusive, but still, intellectually rigorous science.
I'm not entirely sure what that was.
It's the time bell. It's
the time bell saying, let's end. So yeah, thank you, Sven. That was wonderful, and I think this has been a really productive forum at the end. So thank you all for coming today. Thanks, Sven.
Thanks. Cheers. Thanks, Sally. Interesting to know what